Much of graphic design is built around typography. That is the use of words to communicate meaning. Obviously, graphic design uses a lot of imagery and arrangement of elements, but the use of words and text is primary to it because it's all about communicating a message. Typography is defined as the art and process of designing and arranging type. A type foundry is a company that creates type. So this goes back to the days, in the early days of printing, when printing was done using metal blocked letters that were, metal was heated, forged, and crafted into various letters. And that terminology has stayed with us today, even though graphic design today and font and typeface design is done digitally. It still maintains that original terminology of a type foundry. So companies that create type are called foundries. The distinction between typeface and font is important to make on a technical level. We often use these interchangeably, but technically speaking, a typeface is a family of fonts like Helvetica, Arial, Times New Roman, and then within that typeface there would be any number of fonts that are specified by additional features such as style, like italics or bold or condensed, or size down to your very 10 point, 12 point, etc. Your font size. So all of those work together to create the font, but the typeface is the family of fonts of which we generally are referring. There are, let's say, 4 major types of classifications of typefaces. There are 4 additional ones that you should also be familiar with. But the 2 basic types would be serif and sans serif. Now, serif refers to the small line or stroke that's attached to the ends of a larger stroke, and so you have these 2 types, serif, and then sans, meaning without a serif, is the other type. Now, out of that, then you also have a slab serif, which is a thick block serif font. And these first 3 often work together. We call this the rule of 3 when it comes to design. Typically in a design you want 2 or 3 fonts and no more. And the third font would be this slab serif should you want it. It's a great for accents. A monospace font is a typeface where characters occupy the same amount of horizontal space. And as you can see, this just is basically a typewriter type of font. So it goes back to the days of typewriters where every character was evenly spaced between one another, and it gives you this typewriter type look. So maybe times you want to use that monospace look. The 4 typefaces that you see here also have their place as well. They are distinct in that the script font is going to mimic handwriting, and that can be very formal or it could be very casual. But the idea is it's mimicking handwriting, but not quite as informal as a handwritten script, as you see there below. Black letter refers to early print styles, so that very classic Gothic look is called black letter. And then, of course, your handwritten style can have all kinds of variations that look very much like handwriting or very neat handwriting, different aspects of that. And then you have an entire group that would be categorized as decorative. They'd be primarily used for headlines. These are very distinctive, very artsy, that would have somewhat limited use, but would be great for headlines or for your primary text. Some terminology as it relates to typeface would be size. Size is measured in points, so in InDesign, that's why we set everything to work in points. There's 72 points in an inch, or 6 picas in an inch. And this is the same term that we're using when we talk about point size in the font as well, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, etc., or when we indent at 6 or 12 points. So we work in points in InDesign. The leading refers to the space between the lines vertically, so the space between the lines above and below one another. In InDesign, and Illustrator for that matter, this is set automatically, but you could always override it. It's set to be optimal for reading, but there may be times you want to tweak that a bit to squeeze a little bit more text into a space or to fill it out a bit more. You don't want to mess with this too much because it can affect readability. Tracking is the kind of a horizontal version of that, and that's the overall spacing in a selection of letters. So if you select a word or a group of words and you want to spread them out, this is the tracking. And again, you don't want to go too far with this typically, because then that does begin to affect readability if you condense it too much or if you spread it out too much. Kerning refers to the space between characters of type. And so kerning, character, that might be the memory tip for you, that this is when you are just adjusting the space between individual characters in a particular word. Some letters are wider than others and some are narrow, and so you may want to do some fine tuning and adjusting, particularly for headline fonts. Typically, particularly in a newsletter, you're going to have an article. You're going to have a heading. You're going to have some subheadings within the article, and then you're going to have body text. And the general rule is that for your body text, you want to use a serif font. This has demonstrated to be easier for reading, so most of your books are going to be published with a serif font in the body text, leaving your headings, subheadings to be sans serif fonts. And those may be two sans serif fonts that are complementary to one another. They may be very similar in the same family, maybe the same font, just a different style or width applied to it. I mentioned earlier the rule of 3, and that is that in any particular document you would use no more than 3 fonts. Your first 2 are going to be a sans serif and a serif for your heads, subheads, and your body text. If you needed a third typeface, you would use a slab serif. That is a thicker, wider serif font as an accent. And now some principles of typography to be aware of. Like color use, there is this principle of complementarity, and that is opposites attract. And this is why we prefer to have a sans serif and a serif contrasting with one another in our headline and our body text. So if you're going with 2 different fonts, they need to be significantly different. So there is some contrast there. So it's like red and green on the color wheel. They work well together because they're opposites. Likewise, we also have analogous typefaces, and this would be, for example, a Helvetica is a family of typefaces, but within Helvetica you have various widths and weights, bold, condensed, etc., so that you can stay within the same family, and they all have the same general look, but they can still give you enough contrast that they work well together. So those are basically your 2 approaches to selecting fonts, and it's a big decision. And there's a lot of help in Adobe. When you go to Adobe Typekit, you will find these font families. It will actually give you some tools to help pair fonts and make those important decisions. You also might want to consider the historical period. Obviously, some fonts hearken to a certain area. They're Western looking fonts. There are fonts that seem to fit in the 20s, kind of the Art Deco stuff. There's more modern fonts in the 60s. So every font has a connection with a particular period in which it was designed. And so you certainly wouldn't want to mix those fonts up from different historical eras unless you had a specific design purpose for doing that. You want to stay with classic typefaces in general. You don't want to look for the artsy, unique ones. Again, unless you had a special purpose for that. Generally, you want to stay with the stuff that's proven, that works, that's not going to draw attention to itself. Avoid 2 similar typefaces. In other words, you want your typefaces to be different enough that there's contrast there. If they're too similar, then it makes it look like it's a mistake. Use uppercase and lowercase wisely. Generally, uppercase are great for headlines. They grab attention. They are a little different than lowercase. Lowercase would be a font or a typeface, a case you might want to use to express intimacy or a lack of formality. And you can use lowercase as your headlines, but it communicates something different than using all uppercase. Also keep in mind that uppercase letters like a little more space, so you might want to adjust the kerning when you use uppercase, and lowercase you may be able to squish together a little more. But there's something about those that require a little bit different kerning or tracking if you're doing entire words. Use a legible font size, so go 10 to 12 point at a minimum. It's comfortable for reading. Don't mix size and weight. So throughout your document, be consistent with the fonts that you use. Just pick a couple and stick with them for consistency. Pay attention to kerning, and this again is a space between characters. It does make a difference, and so when you want to fine-tune something, you can adjust the space between them using the kerning adjustments. Create a unified mood, meaning you want the same look. Consistency is so key when it comes particularly to newsletters. Well, really anything involving typography is consistency. Is the rule. Use proper alignment, so that means flush to the left and then ragged to the right. Sometimes you'll see people use full justification. The danger of that is sometimes it will force words to be stretched out, and you'll have to just kind of go in line by line and adjust the kerning to get it to look right. So generally, ragged right, flush left is what we want. Create contrast between the typeface and the background. So obviously black type on a white background gives us the best contrast, but there are times you have a color background, and so you need to make sure that your typeface has significant contrast for good readability. Maintain typeface integrity. This simply means you want to adjust the point size of your font rather than grabbing the text box and dragging it up or down to scale it. When you do that, you are damaging the integrity of that font. So just always change the point size. Don't just scale up or down the font. And then, of course, avoid widows and orphans. Those are words, single words that fall down to the next line, as I am showing you there. You need to adjust whatever you can to avoid that from happening. It just doesn't look good to leave a single word down at the bottom of a paragraph. Use even and consistent spacing. You can check this by showing hidden characters. I think the shortcut is Option-Command-I in InDesign. I think it's the same in Illustrator. And this will reveal all of the spaces and returns and paragraphs, all those things. It'll show you if you've got extra characters so you can have consistent spacing. I think I showed you a way to do that in InDesign where you can find and fix those with just a couple clicks, do an entire document. Stop using underlines, italicize instead. So very rarely would you ever want to underline something. It's much cleaner to use italics rather than the underline feature. Avoid novelty typefaces. Back when desktop publishing was just bursting into the scene in the 90s, we had a lot of fancy, fun fonts. Comic Sans and Papyrus were two of them that were really popular to the point where they got overused and they became jokes. So unless you've got a good reason to use them for a parody, avoid those. And then, of course, as always, remember that rules may be broken for good reasons. At the end of the day, these are principles, and there may be design choices that you make that require you to break some of those rules to draw attention to something, provide emphasis, or communicate something in some way. So there you go, basic principles, rules for typography.